After being drugged, Bond wakes up to meet one of the series' best Bond girls.
Who are you?
My name is Pussy Galore.
Pussy Galore, played by Honor Blackman, who is flying the pair to Kentucky, where we once again meet with Goldfinger and Oddjob and are introduced to Pussy's flying circus. And that's not a metaphor. Bond is promptly locked away and will spend much of the rest of this film under capture. It's a common criticism of this film that Bond doesn't really do that much for the whole second half of this film. He's just kind of skirting by the skin of his teeth until the very end. He doesn't really do much other than break out once, only to be captured again. But to be honest, he does do a lot more than people give him credit for. I mean, he does turn Pussy over to the side of good in a scene that more than vaguely resembles a rape. But what's the good of consent anyway? Just force yourself on a woman and they'll eventually succumb. And by turning Pussy to the side of good, he does save the lives of everyone at Fort Knox. And of course, once he's in Fort Knox, he defeats Oddjob, meaning the bomb can be defused. But before we get all that, we have a fun scene of Goldfinger revealing the entirety of his dastardly plan to a room full of investors, which Bond spies on. What Bond doesn't see, though, is that the entire room are gassed after the presentation, and the one guy who wanted out of the deal, Mr. Solo, receives a very, very, very lengthy sequence involving Oddjob killing him and then crushing the car holding his corpse. This whole sequence takes about 5 minutes and nothing is really gained from it except to show the ineptitude of Felix. And to be honest, I'd rather they didn't show the car getting crushed and Solo being shot. I'd rather we just see Solo driven off by Oddjob, then immediately have the scene with Bond and Pussy and Goldfinger on the porch, and then Oddjob returns in a truck with a crushed cube on the back, and Goldfinger gives his line about separating his gold from the late Mr. Solo. It's a case where I wish what happened to Solo had just been left to our imaginations. I didn't need to see this pointless character get shot and then see the car getting crushed. It's not important. Just like it wasn't important to see Oddjob cracking open a can of Dulux paint and, getting the brush in, dipping it in, painting Jill Masterton to death. Sometimes these things are more effective when they're left to our imaginations. And it's been said many times before, but of course it makes absolutely no sense that Goldfinger would go to the effort of explaining his plan to all these people just to kill them all anyway. Actually, but then again, that model must have been expensive and quite time-consuming to make, so why not show it off, I suppose? Who made that model anyway? Was it Oddjob's artistic side project? He's a terrible caddy, so maybe miniatures are his real hobby. Anyway, after all that, we have some nice scenes with Goldfinger, Bond and Pussy where Goldfinger's plan becomes completely apparent to Bond. The villain plans to use a bomb provided by the Chinese to radiate the gold in Fort Knox, rendering it useless for 58 years. This act would increase the value of Goldfinger's own gold significantly and give the Chinese an economic advantage from the immediate chaos, hence why Mr. Ling and all these Chinese blokes are knocking around Kentucky, USA. This is one of the best villain schemes in the entire series, and Goldfinger is well within his right to look so gleeful as Bond susses it all out. After all the fun and frivolity at the Oryx Stud, we see Operation Grand Slam put into action, with dozens of military men being seemingly gassed to death by Pussy Galore's flying circus. Again, not a euphemism. Goldfinger, Oddjob, Bond and company make their way into the very vault of Fort Knox as fantastically designed by Ken Adam and Goldfinger's plan for Bond becomes apparent, to leave Bond to die in the vault when the bomb goes off. This is delightfully devious. However, it turns out the troops at Fort Knox are not gassed to death at all, and Felix leads an assault on the base. Shit kicks off, and I absolutely love what Goldfinger does here. He sees American troops, and he instantly runs up to seal the vault, then he takes off his coat to reveal a military uniform, runs back out, shoots Chinese agent Mr. Ling, mows down a group of soldiers, and escapes in a helicopter with Pussy. I love how prepared he was for this whole thing. He had full confidence in the plan, sure, but he had a backup ready to go and didn't waste a second before acting it out. His shooting of Mr. Ling also tells us a lot about how Goldfinger felt about the Chinese involvement in the plan. He was obviously only in cahoots with them to get a hold of the bomb. He doesn't really care about their goals from the plan at all. All he cares about is the value of his own gold. Trapped inside the vault, Bond and Oddjob battle it out in one of the classic fight scenes of the series. I think it serves as a nice counter to Bond's fight with Grant in the previous film. In that fight, the space was very small, the editing fast and frantic, the sound of the train blaring away. It was a lot of fast, loud, still stuff. Here, the space is big, the editing is much slower, and aside from the slight ticking of the bomb, the footsteps and the sound of the punches, there really isn't that much in the way of sound design for this sequence, and yet it still equals Bond's battle with the henchman from the previous film, but in a totally different way. The one big similarity between the two fights, though, is that it is the henchman's own deadly gadget that leads to his demise. The good guys make their way into the vault as Bond makes his way into the bomb, and I love that he's so puzzled as to what to do when he opens it. He's just like, fuck, what do I do now? When it really just takes a simple flick of a switch to defuse the thing. So the day is saved and Bond is on his way to meet the President of the United States for dinner when Goldfinger pops up again. Something that has always puzzled me about this scene is that Goldfinger clearly has a henchman stood behind him in some of these shots. Like, okay, I guess at one point Bond probably had a little tussle with this guy during his fight with Goldfinger and for whatever reason they decided to cut it, but they could have done a better job with hiding the guy. You can see him so clearly in a few shots. It's kind of distracting. At first you wonder if it's some film crew member accidentally getting into the shot. Anyway, whatever the guy's deal is, he obviously goes up in flames as Bond and Pussy parachute out of the out-of-control plane, as he isn't seen tangled up in a tree or anything. Goldfinger's death here is completely awesome, by the way. If I ever do a top 10 Bond deaths list, I expect this one to rank very highly. And so the film ends with Bond and Pussy staying undercover while Felix and other US officials search for the agent from the sky. The whole process is probably quite a waste of money for the US government. I mean, you know, that a helicopter must have been quite expensive to pilot, and, you know, I'm sure Felix has more important things to be getting on with, but, you know, what's all that compared with Bond shagging a former lesbian? So, that's Goldfinger, and look, I know I did a lot of nitpicking, as I always do in these videos, but I really can't express enough just how much I love this film. Goldfinger is the Bond film that, once you've seen it, you've had a crash course in all the right cinematic Bond elements. If someone had never seen a Bond film and you had to recommend just one to them, make sure that they see just one before they die, I'm pretty sure this would be the one you'd recommend. For the longest time, this was considered to be the best Bond film of them all, and while I think that mass perception has changed a bit, I think people are more likely to cite either From Russia with Love or Casino Royale as the best in the series these days, but Goldfinger has always been held in high regard and will continue to do so, I'm sure, for a long period of time. This was the Bond film that all others had to shape up to. And maybe it will be again one day very soon, but I feel as mass movie tastes shifted to more serious in the mid-noughties, I feel like Goldfinger got dismissed as just another one of those silly Bond films from the 60s, when it's actually so much more than that. But there is still just a plethora of stuff to enjoy here. Sean Connery is on his finest form as Bond, in my opinion, which does make up for the fact that Bond himself doesn't really do a whole lot in this film, especially in the second half. He does a lot of following around and snooping, but he gets captured a lot. Yeah, he defeats Oddjob, but Goldfinger caused his own death. Some other guy had to defuse the bomb, and heck, Bond couldn't even beat Goldfinger at golf without cheating his way to a win. But I don't care about all that, because Connery is so enigmatic and glorious in this film. It makes up for everything the character does wrong or doesn't do at all in this film. This is the classic Connery Bond performance. I think he's great in From Russia with Love, but it's here that he perfects his portrayal of 007, even if that scene in the barn with Pussy is a bit difficult to swallow in this modern age. In fact, more about that scene. I want to know, does it bother anyone else? Like, he does just basically force himself onto a non-consenting woman. Or should I stop being so politically correct about things and just accept the scene for what it is and accept it as an example of what the perception of women was like in the 1960s? Anyway, speaking of Pussy, isn't Honor Blackman just stunning and gorgeous and wonderful in this film? She looks so comfortable here. Her and Connery have the best chemistry of any Connery-era Bond girl. She's perfect and fabulous, and I love her, and she's a classic Bond girl. It's great that every supporting character in this film has gone on to be a classic of their specification in the Bond universe, be they a villain, a henchman, or a Bond girl. Our main villain is also quite magnificent in every way, shape and form. I'll talk more about Goldfinger in a villain-specific video, but Gert Frobe is perfect. It's so rare for a dubbed performance to come off strong at all. There's usually a bit of a disconnect between the voice and the physical person, but here it works so well. It might not be perfectly synced at times, but this voice blends with Frobe better than his real voice. Now, not to sound like a broken record, but rounding off our main characters is Harold Sakata as Oddjob, and he's pretty crap actually. Probably the worst henchman of the series, really don't care for him at all. Nah, I'm just messing with you, he's perfect too. And come on, that car. That car. If there's a fifth main character in this film, the DB5 is it. It's not often that Sean Connery can be challenged for screen presence, never mind being challenged by an inanimate object, but this car is the sex. It has a beauty to rival any Bond girl. The score of this film is awesome, except some overly brassy bits. The cinematography is great. I highly recommend watching this film on Blu-ray. For a nearly 50-year-old film, on Blu-ray it looks as if it could have been made yesterday. The script is perfectly judged as well. This is a fun film. It's the funnest of the Bond films that have been made so far in 1964, but it never falls into self-parody. There is a danger present at times, and there are moments when you get on the edge of your seat in excitement. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. This film is just so good. Is there even anything to nitpick about? But, you know, I guess it could maybe do with one more big action sequence, and some sequences do go on a little bit too long. The gassing of Fort Knox, the death of Mr. Solo, these bits do last a little too long for me. It feels like padding. But these ever so minor quibbles, please don't ever go at me for nitpicking, because as a whole, Goldfinger is just superb. It's as good as its reputation would lead you to believe. It's a perfect blending of every Bond ingredient, and it's my favourite Sean Connery Bond film. So it's quite ironic that its immediate follow-up is probably my least favourite Connery Bond film, and indeed one of my least favourite films in the series. Next time we'll be reviewing the fourth feature-length Bond film, Thunderball. And I'll give you a hint for next time, folks. I still hate Thunderball.